My name is Matilda Harper. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 7 years, I've worked as a senior data analyst in a mid-sized tech firm in Seattle. Most people who meet me for the first time describe me the same way: calm, agreeable, reliable. I'm not the loudest voice in the meeting. I don't interrupt. I don't dominate whiteboards with grand gestures. I listen. I take notes. I deliver what I promise. And over time, people start to assume something about you when you're that way. They assume you're safe to overlook. They assume you won't fight for credit. They assume you won't notice when something small is taken from you. What they don't understand is that quiet is not the same as unaware, and stillness is not the same as weakness. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about public humiliation or dramatic confrontations. No one flipped a table. No one screamed in a boardroom. There were no cinematic speeches. It's about something subtler. It's about how one of my coworkers deleted months of my work in an attempt to sabotage a project that carried my name. It's about how I discovered the deletion. And it's about the moment IT confirmed his username was deleted at 11:42 p.m. But more than that, it's about what happens when you underestimate someone who has been quietly documenting everything. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I didn't retaliate in anger. I restored everything from cloud backup, and then I shared the activity log. The emotional journey of this story isn't explosive. It's layered. It's about the slow normalization of disrespect, the small dismissals that seem too minor to challenge, the way people assign you a role without asking who you are. And it's about the moment you decide to step out of that role, not loudly, but permanently. If you've ever been the dependable one, the one who fixes things behind the scenes, the one people assume will just handle it quietly, you might recognize yourself in this. Because sometimes the most powerful shift in a room happens without a raised voice. Have you ever realized that people only saw the version of you that was convenient for them? To them, I was the safe one, the dependable one. If a deadline was tight, they handed it to me. If a presentation needed polishing at the last minute, they sent it to me. If something broke in the system, and no one knew why, they quietly forwarded the issue to my inbox. I became the person who just handled things. No one formally assigned me that identity. It formed gradually, like condensation on glass. At first, it felt like trust. Then it started to feel like expectation. Eventually, it became invisible. In meetings, I rarely spoke first. I preferred listening, mapping the dynamics, understanding who needed validation and who needed facts. When I did speak, it was concise, data-backed, clean. People nodded, and then someone louder would repeat my point 5 minutes later, with more enthusiasm, and suddenly it was innovative. I remember the first time that happened. I told myself it didn't matter. The work was what mattered. The result was what mattered. Credit was secondary. That's what I believed then. My coworker, Daniel, was the opposite of me in almost every visible way. Charismatic, quick with humor, comfortable filling silence. He had a way of presenting half-formed ideas with such confidence that people assumed the details would follow. We were assigned to the same major project, a predictive analytics model that would influence how our company allocated marketing budgets for the next fiscal year. It was high visibility, high pressure, on paper. We were co-leads. In practice, I built the architecture. Daniel handled stakeholder communication. To the outside departments, he was the face. To the system, I was the backbone. I didn't resent that dynamic at first. I told myself it was complementary. Some people shine in front of a room. Some people build what makes the room worth listening to. But subtle patterns began forming. Emails praising Daniel's strategic leadership would circulate. My name would appear in the third paragraph. Sometimes, not at all. When leadership had technical questions, they asked Daniel, and he would turn to me mid-meeting and say, "Matilda can explain the details." The phrasing was small, almost harmless, but it positioned me as support, not an architect. Support? I don't think anyone consciously decided I should be secondary. It was more like gravity. The louder personality drifted upward. The quieter one stabilized the floor. And I let it happen. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed excellence would speak eventually. I also knew something they didn't. Every dataset, every iteration, every adjustment to the model, it all lived in structured repositories under my supervision. I documented everything not out of paranoia, but habit. Time-stamped revisions, version histories, access logs. Redundant backups are synced automatically to the cloud. It was simply how I worked. Precision was my language. At the office, though, I smiled easily. I stayed composed. I didn't challenge meeting summaries even when they subtly tilted credit. If someone had described me during that period, they would have said, Matilda's solid, low drama, easy to work with. No one would have said, she sees everything. And that was the quiet advantage. Because when you're underestimated, people lower their guard. They assume you won't track patterns. They assume you won't notice who edits what, who downloads which files, who accesses folders after hours. They assume you trust by default. I didn't distrust anyone, but I never stopped observing. And at that stage, I still believed that observation was simply professionalism, not preparation. Looking back, that was the version of me they were comfortable with. Reliable, useful, invisible. They had no idea that invisibility, when paired with documentation, is not a weakness. It's leverage. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve deleted files or late-night access logs. It was a slide. One slide in a deck we were presenting to senior leadership. I had spent 3 nights refining the forecasting model behind it. Not just the visuals, the underlying assumptions, the weight adjustments, the sensitivity analysis that made the projections credible instead of optimistic fiction. When Daniel and I rehearsed, he skimmed past the technical explanation. Let's not drown them in numbers, he said lightly. We'll keep it high level. I nodded. That made sense. Executives rarely want to see the scaffolding, but the day of the presentation, when the slide appeared on screen, Daniel said something that made my stomach tighten, not in anger, but in awareness. I adjusted the modeling approach to make it more adaptive. He explained smoothly, we're using a weighted regression structure now. I didn't correct him, because technically, yes, we were using weighted regression. What he didn't say was that I had built it from scratch. The adjustment had been a 48-hour recalibration after discovering a flaw in the historical data feed. It was subtle. If you weren't listening carefully, you wouldn't notice. Leadership nodded approvingly. Someone said, great strategic shift. Daniel smiled. We wanted to stay ahead of volatility. I remember sitting there, hands folded loosely in my lap, feeling something very small shift inside me. Not outrage, not humiliation, recognition. This wasn't an accident. It was positioning. Afterward, in the hallway, one of the directors stopped Daniel to compliment him. I stood slightly behind them. The director glanced at me and said, good support, Matilda. Support? That word again. I smiled politely. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked by my desk. Great job today, he said. They loved it. They liked the direction, I replied evenly. He leaned casually against the edge of my desk. See, team effort. Team effort. I nodded again. But I noticed something else that week. The shared project folder showed minor structural changes. A few files reorganized. A couple was renamed. Nothing disruptive, just enough to suggest control. He hadn't deleted anything. He hadn't sabotaged anything. He was just adjusting ownership. I could have addressed it then. I could have said, let's clarify contribution lines before the next presentation. It would have been reasonable. Instead, I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe he didn't realize how it sounded. Maybe leadership already knew my role. Maybe I was being sensitive. It's remarkable how quickly intelligent people rationalize discomfort when it's socially inconvenient to challenge it. The pattern was small. That's why it worked. Small enough to ignore, small enough to excuse, small enough to avoid confrontation. But I didn't forget it. That's the difference. Some people dismiss discomfort because it isn't catastrophic. I catalog it, not emotionally, structurally. That was the first cut, barely visible. But it drew a line I couldn't unsee. After the first slide incident, nothing exploded. That's the unsettling part. Life at the office continued exactly as before. Meetings, deadlines, status updates, Slack messages at odd hours, coffee refills, polite smiles in the hallway. And that's how subtle disrespect becomes normal by never becoming dramatic enough to challenge. Daniel didn't suddenly transform into a villain. He remained charming, helpful, quick to volunteer for high-visibility conversations. He CC'd me on emails. He said we consistently, but the weight of that we was uneven. In meetings, he began answering technical questions before I could. Not incorrectly, but incompletely. He'd give a simplified explanation, then glance at me as if inviting elaboration. "Matilda can fill in the deep technical parts," he'd say. It sounded inclusive. It positioned me as detail, not direction. The more it happened, the more the room accepted that structure. Leadership began looking to him first, even when the question clearly required model-level understanding. I started noticing the micro pauses, that half second where I considered speaking earlier, that calculation will correcting this create friction. It never felt worth it in the moment. Each incident was minor, individually defensible, and that's how normalization works. No single event feels serious enough to escalate, but repetition builds architecture. I rationalized my silence as professionalism. There's no need to compete for airtime. The work speaks for itself. Results matter more than perception. That's what I told myself. And technically, I was right. Our model's performance metrics exceeded expectations. Forecast accuracy was climbing. Stakeholders were adopting our recommendations. On paper, we were succeeding, but perception was drifting. One afternoon, I overheard two managers discussing the project near the break room. "Daniel's really driving this initiative," one of them said. "Yeah, he stepped up." The other agreed. Stepped up? I stood there longer than necessary, stirring my coffee even after the sugar had dissolved. It wasn't anger I felt. It was clarity forming, because I knew exactly how many nights I had stayed late recalibrating anomaly detection thresholds. I knew who debugged the pipeline when it crashed. I knew whose credentials authenticated the API integrations. I also knew something else. The shared drive recorded access histories. Every edit, every rename, every deletion, even temporary ones. I hadn't needed that information before. It was just part of the system. But now I found myself glancing at activity logs occasionally, not obsessively, just curiously. Patterns tell stories, and patterns were forming. Daniel increasingly downloaded local copies of files before presentations. He adjusted formatting. Sometimes he slightly altered wording in documentation summaries. Nothing damaging, but ownership is a story told in small edits. Meanwhile, I continued delivering exactly as expected. Reliable, calm, responsive. If you had asked anyone at that point whether there was tension between us, they would have laughed. No, they work great together, and in a functional sense, we did. That's the quiet cruelty of normalization. From the outside, everything looks stable. From the inside, you begin shrinking to maintain harmony. I wasn't shrinking in skill, I was shrinking in visibility. And I allowed it because I believed professionalism meant absorbing minor injustice without complaint. I hadn't yet understood that silence, when automatic, becomes permission. It happened during a quarterly planning meeting, not the kind with executives, just mid-level managers aligning budgets and deliverable. The atmosphere was casual, laptops open, coffee cups were scattered across the table, a whiteboard filled with arrows and optimistic deadlines. Daniel was outlining our next phase rollout when one of the marketing leads said, "We'll rely on Daniel for strategic direction, and Matilda will make sure the technical pieces are solid." No one questioned it. No one looked at me for confirmation. It was spoken as fact, a settled dynamic, strategic direction, technical support. The labels landed softly, but they locked into place. In that moment, I realized something important. I hadn't been overlooked accidentally. I had been categorized. There's a difference. Overlooking is passive. Categorizing is structural. Without confrontation, without malice. A role had been assigned to me: reliable, useful, invisible infrastructure. The person who ensures the machine runs, but isn't seen as the one designing it. And I had cooperated, because I value competence over recognition, because I dislike public correction, because I believed integrity would surface naturally. But organizations don't run on invisible integrity. They run on perception, narrative, and positioning. I had mastered execution. Daniel had mastered narrative. That day, as the meeting continued, I stopped listening to the words and started listening to the pattern. Every time a decision was framed, it was framed through him. Daniel suggested, Daniel recommended, Daniel believes. Even when those suggestions originated in Slack threads I had initiated. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct anyone, but something recalibrated internally. For the first time, I asked myself a quiet question. If something went wrong, whose name would be attached to it? And I knew the answer immediately. Mine, because while he was positioned as strategy, I was positioned as execution. And execution carries blame when numbers fail. That's the danger of invisibility. It absorbs risk without holding authority. After the meeting, Daniel clapped me lightly on the shoulder. "Good alignment in there," he said. "We're a solid duo." "A duo?" I smiled, but my mind was elsewhere. Because I had just understood the full structure, I wasn't being silenced. I was being utilized. There's a subtle difference. Silence suggests oppression. Utilization suggests usefulness without elevation. And useful people are rarely promoted beyond their utility. That evening, I stayed late not because of a deadline, but because I wanted to observe something. I opened the project repository and reviewed permission levels, editing rights, deletion rights, administrative override. Daniel and I had identical access. That fact lingered longer than it should have. Up until then, I had never questioned it. We were co-leads. Of course. We had equal permissions. But now I saw the architecture differently. Narrative control on the surface, system control underneath, and equal technical access between us. I closed my laptop gently that night. No anger, no urgency, just awareness. Roles are powerful things, especially the ones you never formally agree to. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a presentation. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening when almost everyone had already left the office. I stayed behind not unusually. I preferred working when the floor was calm, and the fluorescent lights hummed softly without interruption. There's a certain clarity that comes when the noise of personalities fades, and only systems remain. I was reviewing performance logs for the model's most recent deployment. Nothing dramatic, just validating outputs against live data streams, routine maintenance. That's when I noticed something small, a version discrepancy. One of the submodel configuration files had been altered. Not broken, just adjusted. A threshold value slightly changed. It hadn't impacted results yet, but it would have if left unnoticed. I checked the timestamp, 9:17 p.m. Earlier that week, I checked the activity log, Daniel's credentials. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen longer than necessary. He hadn't mentioned touching the configuration, and technically, he had the right to. We were co-leads, but it wasn't the edit itself that shifted something in me. It was the silence around it. If I had made that change, I would have documented it in the shared notes, flagged it, sent a message. Transparency is how I operate, but this adjustment had been made quietly without context. I reverted the threshold to its previous validated value. Then I created a new internal documentation file, not in the shared notes, but in my personal encrypted workspace. Nothing accusatory, just a record, timestamp, file name, change description, user credential. I didn't confront him the next day. I didn't even mention it. Instead, I began watching differently. There's a moment when silence stops being passive and becomes intentional. That Tuesday night was mine. Until then, my quiet had been rooted in trust and professionalism. After that, it became a strategic observation, not because I wanted conflict, but because I realized something essential. If perception already tilted in his favor, then facts would need to be undeniable if anything ever required correction. You can't argue perception with emotion. You counter it with evidence. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle behaviors I might have ignored before. He requested summary exports of datasets that already lived in shared space. He downloaded presentation-ready visuals without tagging revisions. He occasionally reorganized folder structures late at night. Again, nothing catastrophic, but patterns. Patterns matter, and more importantly, I felt something shift internally. For the first time, I stopped assuming we were aligned in intent. That doesn't mean I assumed malice, but I stopped assuming shared transparency. It's a quiet but profound change when you move from trust to verification. Not loudly, not suspiciously, just structurally. That week, I implemented automated backup snapshots to my personal cloud archive, completely compliant with company policy, version histories preserved, activity logs mirrored. Redundancy isn't dramatic, it's preventative. If nothing ever happened, those backups would simply exist unused. But if something did, I would never rely on memory. I would rely on data. The shift wasn't emotional, it was architectural, and that's why no one noticed it. After that Tuesday night, my behavior didn't change in ways anyone could see. I still arrived on time. I still delivered early. I still responded to emails with calm precision. But internally, something had reorganized. Silence was no longer the default. It was selected. When Daniel summarized our progress in meetings, I let him speak uninterrupted. Not because I agreed with every nuance, but because I was listening differently now. I wasn't tracking tone. I was tracking claims. Every statement implied authorship, every phrase that shifted origin, every I suggested that replaced a Slack thread I could scroll back to. I didn't challenge him. Not yet. There's a misconception that strength requires immediate correction, that if you don't push back in the moment, you've lost something. But correction without leverage is just friction, and friction without evidence makes you look defensive. So I let the room continue believing the version of events that was easiest to digest. Meanwhile, I refined my systems. I activated more granular activity alerts on the repository, not intrusive, just notifications for structural changes and deletions. I organized my documentation so that every model iteration had a parallel time-stamped record in my private archive. If you had looked at me from across the office, you would have seen the same composed analyst. Daniel certainly did. He began leaning more confidently into his visible leadership role, scheduling stakeholder syncs without looping me in until afterward, drafting executive summaries before I reviewed technical updates. Sometimes he'd say, "I simplified the explanation so it's clearer." Simplified. That word became familiar. Simplified narratives are powerful. They remove complexity, and complexity often contains authorship. A few times, I considered confronting him directly. It would have been easy. "Hey, can we align on messaging? Let's clarify the contribution before the next presentation." Reasonable, polite, professional, but something told me that wouldn't solve the underlying issue, because this wasn't about miscommunication. It was about positioning. And positioning doesn't change because you ask nicely. It changes when the structure no longer supports distortion. Silence gave me something valuable. Visibility. People talk more freely when they don't feel threatened. They assume alignment. They assume trust. Daniel occasionally made offhand comments about managing perception, about owning the room, about how leadership values clarity over technical depth. None of those statements was wrong, but they revealed priority. And priorities shape decisions under pressure. The more I observed, the more I realized something else. He underestimated my awareness. He mistook composure for passivity. He mistook restraint for compliance. And that miscalculation would matter later. One afternoon, as we were finalizing materials for a major executive review, he said casually, "If this goes well, it'll put us in a strong position for promotion." Us. I looked at him carefully when he said it. He believed that. He believed the narrative we'd built publicly would naturally benefit both of us. And maybe, in his mind, it would. But promotions follow perception, and perception had been drifting steadily in one direction. I didn't argue. I didn't warn him. I simply made sure that every critical file now existed in 3 places: the shared drive, the company's cloud backup, and my encrypted, time-stamped archive. Silence, when chosen intentionally, is not surrender. It's calibration. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. There were no secret meetings, no whispered phone calls in parking garages, no dramatic music swelling in the background of my life. There was just a process. After I began treating silence as a strategy, I approached my work differently. Not louder, not colder, just more deliberate. The first thing I did was standardize documentation beyond what was required. Every model revision now had a structured summary, objective of change, variables affected, performance impact, author credential, timestamp. I formatted it cleanly, almost academically. Anyone reviewing it could trace the evolution of the system step by step. No interpretation needed, just facts. Second, I studied the repository permissions more deeply. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was mapping vulnerability. Who could delete root folders? Who could override version history? What triggered permanent deletion versus recoverable deletion? Most people don't explore those questions unless something breaks. I explored them before anything did. The irony is that I had always been the responsible one, the one who anticipated failure points, the one who built redundancy so the system wouldn't collapse under stress. But this time, the stress I was modeling wasn't technical. It was human. Daniel continued operating as usual. He refined slide decks, led conversations, joked easily with leadership. Sometimes he'd compliment me publicly. "Matilda's the engine behind this," he'd say with a smile. People would nod appreciatively. Compliments can be positioning tools. Calling someone the engine frames them as machinery. Essential but not visionary. I didn't resent him. I studied the framing. Over time, I also noticed something subtle in his behavior patterns. Late-night logins, not constant, not suspicious enough to raise alarms, but frequent enough to establish a rhythm. 10:58 p.m., 11:16 p.m., 12:03 a.m., usually followed by file access, often presentation-related folders or summary exports. Again, not illegal, not prohibited, but when someone consistently operates outside visible hours, it means they prefer edits that aren't immediately observed. I never mentioned it. Instead, I activated automated cloud mirroring at 15-minute intervals. Every shared directory snapshot was now preserved in immutable format. If something changed, I would have a record of what existed before the change. I wasn't building a case. I was building certainty. There's a difference. Certainty removes emotional reaction. It replaces it with clarity. During this period, something else shifted inside me. I stopped seeking acknowledgement. That might sound small, but it's not. When you no longer crave correction in the moment, you stop reacting to microaggressions. You stop measuring worth against meeting summaries. You focus on architecture, and architecture is patient. One afternoon, IT sent a routine company-wide reminder about data retention policies. Most people skimmed it. I read every line. Retention timelines, deletion recovery windows, audit log storage duration. Information most people consider irrelevant becomes powerful when understood in context. And here's the part no one noticed. I stopped volunteering for extra clarification in meetings, not out of pettiness, but observation. If Daniel wanted to simplify explanations publicly, I allowed him to. If simplification ever crossed into distortion, the data would exist to correct it. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about ensuring that if truth is required, it arrives complete. Weeks passed. Nothing dramatic happened, but the structure was ready. And sometimes, preparation feels unnecessary right until the moment it becomes essential. It happened on a Thursday morning, not late at night, not during a dramatic presentation, just an ordinary start to the day. I arrived at the office around 8:10 a.m., earlier than most. I like the quiet before inboxes start demanding attention. I opened my laptop, took a sip of coffee, and navigated to the shared project directory to finalize a report we were scheduled to present the following week. The folder was empty, not reorganized, not renamed, empty. For a moment, I assumed it was a sync error. Sometimes the cloud interface lags before refreshing. I closed the window, reopened it, still empty. A strange stillness settled over me. Not panic. Not yet. I checked the parent directory. The entire project folder was gone. Months of work, model iterations, validation scripts, presentation drafts, documentation. Gone. Around me, the office hummed to life as coworkers filtered in, chairs rolled across the carpet. Someone laughed near the kitchen. My pulse remained steady, because while the shared drive showed nothing, I knew something they didn't. Every 15 minutes, an immutable snapshot had been archived in my encrypted cloud storage. I didn't rush. I opened the system activity log instead. Deletion event, timestamp 11:42 p.m., user credential Daniel Mercer. There it was. Clear, undeniable, structured. He hadn't just adjusted a file this time. He had deleted the entire root project directory. I stared at the timestamp longer than necessary. 11:42 p.m., late enough that few people would notice immediately, early enough that he might assume I wouldn't log in until morning. I felt no surge of anger, just clarity. There are moments in life when suspicion becomes fact, and when it does, emotion often complicates response. But facts simplify. I opened my encrypted archive and restored the most recent full snapshot locally. Every file, every subfolder, every line of code, intact. Then I paused. This was the decision moment not about confrontation, but about framing. I could have restored everything quietly to the shared drive and said nothing, pretended it was a technical glitch. I could have messaged Daniel privately and asked what happened, but that would allow narrative manipulation. Must have been an accident. Maybe I misclicked, strange system behavior. Instead, I did something simpler. I restored the project folder directly back to the shared drive from the official cloud backup system, not my private archive. Company-sanctioned recovery. Then I drafted a brief, neutral email to IT, subject verification of deletion event project directory. No accusations, no assumptions. Just a request for confirmation of the 11:42 p.m. deletion event logged under Daniel's credentials. I attached a screenshot of the activity log. Then I waited. At 9:18 a.m., Daniel walked in. He smiled casually when he saw me. Morning, morning. I replied evenly. If he felt tension, he didn't show it. At 9:37 a.m., it responded, short, factual, direct. They confirmed his username, deleted them at 11:42 p.m. No ambiguity, no system error, user-initiated deletion. I read the email twice. Still no anger, just alignment. The private reveal wasn't discovering the deletion. It was discovering that I had prepared correctly. The backups worked, the logs were clear, the timing was precise. The narrative could no longer drift. I didn't forward Ite's confirmation immediately. I didn't walk to his desk. I saved the email, and for the first time since this pattern began, I felt something settle fully into place. Not vengeance, not satisfied. Certainty. Because when someone underestimates you, they assume you'll react emotionally. They rarely anticipate composure paired with evidence. And now, the structure that had been quietly built over weeks was no longer theoretical. It was necessary. Once IT confirmed his username was deleted them at 11:42 p.m., the situation stopped being interpretive. It was no longer about tone in meetings, no longer about credit drifting sideways, no longer about perception. It was about intent, and intent changes the weight of every previous moment. I didn't confront Daniel that morning. Instead, I opened a blank document and listed my options. Not emotionally, structurally. Option 1, restore the files quietly. Say nothing. Monitor future behavior. Protect the project. Absorb the incident privately. This would preserve team stability, avoid conflict, maintain my reputation as calm and low drama. It would also signal that deletion, even intentional deletion, had no consequence. Option 2, address him privately. Ask for an explanation. Give him room to frame it as a mistake. This would create plausible deniability. It might result in an apology. It might even repair surface trust. But it would also allow narrative manipulation. Words are flexible, logs are not. Option 3, escalate formally with evidence. Share the activity log and IT confirmation with leadership. Not dramatically, not vindictively, simply factually. This would be irreversible, not explosive, but permanent. I stared at the list for a long time. My decision wasn't about anger. If I were angry, Option 2 would have been tempting immediate confrontation, visible reaction. But anger fades, patterns don't. The question I asked myself was simpler. If I choose silence again, what precedent am I setting for the next boundary? Because this wasn't a renamed file. It wasn't a subtle credit shift. It was a deletion. Entire project architecture removed at 11:42 p.m. hours before a major executive review cycle. There are only two explanations for something like that: recklessness or calculation. Neither is aligned with leadership responsibility. I also thought about something else. If the restoration had failed, if I hadn't mirrored backups, months of validated work would have disappeared. The narrative would have been simple: technical oversight, poor version control, unexpected system failure. And given the roles we had unconsciously accepted, execution absorbs blame, strategy remains intact. That realization made the decision clear, not out of revenge, out of self-respect. I drafted a concise email to our direct supervisor and copied IT, subject project directory deletion and restoration, documentation attached. The body was structured and neutral. Timeline of deletion, confirmation from IT, confirmation of full restoration from cloud backup. Assurance that no data was permanently lost. No adjectives, no speculation, no accusations. Just sequence. I attached the activity log screenshot and IT's written confirmation. Before pressing send, I paused not in doubt, but in acknowledgement. Once sent, the dynamic would change permanently. Silence had protected stability. Documentation would now protect the truth. I pressed send. Then I closed my laptop for a moment and exhaled slowly. The irreversible choice wasn't escalation. It was refusing to carry someone else's risk quietly. And from that point forward, whatever followed would be based on evidence, not interpretation. After I sent the email, nothing dramatic happened. No immediate summons, no sharp Slack notifications, no tense footsteps approaching my desk. The office moved as it always did, keyboards clicking, printers humming, conversations blending into a soft corporate rhythm. Daniel was in a conference room most of the morning. When he walked past my desk around noon, his expression was unchanged. If he had seen the email, he didn't show it, and I didn't look at him any differently. That's the part people misunderstand about strategic action. Once you've done it, you don't hover around the consequences. You continue operating at baseline. By early afternoon, our supervisor responded. Short, controlled, professional. She acknowledged receipt, thanked me for restoring the files promptly, noted that she would review the matter with IT. No emotional language, no immediate judgment. Exactly as it should be. I replied with a single sentence. Please let me know if you need any additional documentation. That was it. Then I returned to work. But while the surface remained calm, I made a few additional moves quiet, preventative ones. First, I adjusted project permissions, not to restrict Daniel specifically. That would have been obvious and confrontational. Instead, I requested that deletion privileges for root-level directories require dual authorization standard risk mitigation for high-impact projects. I framed it as a best practice improvement following the incident. IT approved it quickly. It was reasonable, logical, non-personal. Second, I prepared a clean executive summary of the project's development history. Not a defense document, just a structured timeline of milestones, iterations, and decision points. It highlighted contributions factually, by timestamp and authorship, without commentary. I didn't send it yet, but I had it ready. Third, I ensured that my personal archive was fully synchronized and independently verified, not because I expected further deletion, but because systems should remain resilient under stress. By late afternoon, tension began to ripple faintly through the office. Daniel had been called into a meeting with our supervisor and someone from IT. The door remained closed longer than usual. No raised voices, no visible confrontation. Just time. When he returned to his desk, his movements were slightly tighter, more deliberate. He avoided eye contact with me. Still, no scene. That evening, as most people prepared to leave, our supervisor stopped by my desk. Thank you for restoring everything quickly, she said evenly. We're reviewing access protocols. I nodded. Of course. She studied me for a moment, not suspiciously, but thoughtfully. You handled this professionally. There was something unspoken in her tone. Recognition, perhaps, or recalibration. I didn't linger in the moment. I'm glad the data wasn't lost, I replied, because that was the truth. This was never about catching someone. It was about preventing irreversible damage. And now, the architecture had shifted. Deletion required oversight. Logs had been reviewed. Intent had been questioned even if not publicly. Moving in silence doesn't mean staying still. It means taking actions that stabilize the ground beneath you, while others are still processing what happened. By the time Daniel left that evening, he didn't say goodbye, and I realized something subtle. For the first time, he was aware that I wasn't just the quiet one. I was the one with the record. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They begin as adjustments. The week after the deletion incident, small structural changes started appearing, not dramatic enough to alarm anyone, but significant enough to shift balance. Daniel was no longer the sole voice presenting updates in executive meetings. Our supervisor began asking for technical walkthroughs directly from me, not in a corrective tone, in a recalibrated one. Matilda, can you walk us through the modeling assumptions, Matilda? What risks should we be aware of in the next deployment? The room dynamics shifted subtly. People began looking at me when technical or strategic questions overlapped. Not because I demanded it, because evidence had quietly reframed credibility. Daniel remained composed, but his confidence had changed texture. The effortless fluidity was replaced with caution. He double-checked his statements, paused longer before summarizing conclusions. He was thinking more carefully. That alone told me everything. No public reprimand occurred. No formal announcement was made. But internally, I learned later, IT had documented the deletion as a policy violation pending intent review. Leadership doesn't ignore logged activity tied to high-visibility projects. They simply handle it discreetly, and discretion is more destabilizing than spectacle. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between two senior managers outside a conference room. We need clearer ownership lines. One said, yes. The other replied, especially after last week. They didn't mention names. They didn't need to. Ownership had become a discussion topic, and when ownership becomes explicit, invisible labor surfaces. Daniel attempted to resume normalcy. He invited me to co-present an update, something he rarely insisted on before. We'll both speak equally, he said lightly. I agreed. During that presentation, I didn't overcompensate. I didn't reclaim space aggressively. I simply spoke with clarity, structured explanation, direct attribution when appropriate, as we identified during the anomaly review. Based on the regression recalibration implemented in March, language that made authorship visible without accusation. Afterward, one of the executives stopped me. "Your documentation is impressive," she said. It made the review straightforward. That word lingered. Documentation, not personality, not performance style. Substance? Meanwhile, Daniel's access privileges were adjusted. Quietly. He retained editing rights, but root deletion authority was removed under the new dual authorization policy. No announcement, just a system change. The consequences weren't loud. They were architectural, and architecture reshapes behavior. The office atmosphere shifted in intangible ways. People were more cautious about file changes, more deliberate in written communication, more attentive to attribution. Trust had not shattered, but it had become conditional. Daniel stopped logging in late at night. That pattern ended immediately. Whether from instruction or realization, I don't know. But when behavior shifts abruptly, it signals awareness. One evening, as I packed my bag, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, relief. Because for the first time since the early slide incident, I was no longer shrinking to maintain equilibrium. Equilibrium had adjusted itself, and it did so not because I raised my voice, but because I refused to erase a record. About 2 weeks after the deletion incident, Daniel asked if we could talk, not in a conference room, not formally, just at the small seating area near the windows overlooking the city. The timing told me something. Internal reviews had likely concluded, access changes had been finalized, and whatever explanation he initially offered behind closed doors hadn't restored the original perception. He sat across from me, hands loosely clasped. "I didn't think it would escalate like that," he said carefully. "Escalate?" I noticed the word choice. "I reported a deletion event." I replied calmly. It confirmed it. He exhaled. It wasn't malicious. There was a pause between the words. He looked out the window briefly before continuing. "I was reorganizing files. I meant to archive the folder. I must have misclicked." Misclick. It was a plausible explanation. Technically possible, but unlikely at that scale without multiple confirmation prompts. I didn't argue that point. Instead, I asked gently, "Why at 11:42 p.m.? He hesitated. "I work late sometimes." That was true, but the pattern had already been documented. Late-night logins, silent edits, increasing narrative control. What he didn't realize was that the conversation we were having now wasn't about convincing me. It was about understanding that credibility had shifted. I restored everything immediately. I said, "No data was lost." "I know," he replied quickly, "and I appreciate that. I didn't expect it to become a leadership issue." There it was. The real consequence, not punishment, visibility. Leadership now saw something they hadn't before: risk. And risk alters trust permanently. I didn't frame it as anything, I said evenly. I documented what happened. He studied me for a moment, as if searching for emotion. Anger, resentment, vindication. He wouldn't find them, because this wasn't personal for me anymore. It was structural. "I thought we were aligned," he said quietly. That sentence lingered longer than the others. Aligned. In his mind, perhaps we were. He may have believed that managing perception was part of a partnership, that repositioning narratives was strategic, not deceptive. But alignment requires transparency, and transparency had fractured long before the deletion. I was aligned with the work. I answered, "I can't align with actions I'm not aware of." Silence settled between us. There was something almost regretful in his expression, not necessarily for the deletion, but for misjudging me. He had assumed I would handle the technical damage quietly. He hadn't anticipated that I would also handle the procedural breach with the same calm precision. Some damage can be repaired. Reputation isn't one of them. Not completely, even if leadership never publicly addressed it. The incident now existed in the record, in memory, in policy changes. Trust, once audited, never returns to its original state. We stood up at the same time. "No hard feelings?" he asked, almost cautiously. I considered the question. "I don't operate on feelings at work," I said gently. "I operate on systems." It wasn't cold. It was honest. And by then, it was too late to fix what had shifted. The formal conversation happened 3 days later. Not explosive, not theatrical, just structured. Our supervisors scheduled a meeting with both of us present. The tone in the calendar invite was neutral project governance alignment. When I entered the room, Daniel was already seated. His posture was composed, but less relaxed than it once had been. A representative from IT joined briefly at the start to summarize findings. The summary was clinical. Deletion occurred at 11:42 p.m. under Daniel Mercer's credentials. No evidence of external breach. No system malfunction detected. Files were successfully restored from cloud backup. Dual authorization protocol has been implemented for root-level deletions moving forward. No blame-laden language, just a fact. Once IT left, our supervisor folded her hands calmly. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about trust and clarity of ownership." She looked at Daniel first. Deleting an entire project directory even accidentally demonstrates a lapse in judgment. He nodded. "I understand." No defensiveness, no argument. Then she turned to me. "Matilda, your documentation and restoration response prevented significant damage." I inclined my head slightly. "I prioritize redundancy." That earned the smallest hint of a smile. What followed wasn't a reprimand. It was a recalibration. Ownership of the predictive model would be formally assigned to me going forward, with end-to-end oversight. Daniel would remain involved in stakeholder communication, but without repository control. Again, no drama. Just structure aligning with reality. Daniel spoke then, his voice even. "I want to clarify that I never intended to sabotage the project." Sabotage. Interesting that he chose that word, not our supervisor. She responded calmly. "Intent is difficult to measure. Impact is not." Silence settled briefly. I didn't add commentary. There was nothing to add. The logs existed. The restoration existed. The policy changes existed. Facts had already spoken. At one point, Daniel glanced at me. There was no hostility in his eyes, only recognition. He had expected confrontation, accusation, perhaps even emotional retaliation. Instead, what he received was documentation, and documentation is harder to argue with than anger. Before the meeting ended, our supervisor asked if either of us had anything further to add. Daniel shook his head. I spoke only one sentence. "I'm committed to the project's success." That was it. No commentary on the past, no reference to patterns, no emotional subtext. Because confrontation without heat is powerful. It removes spectacle. It leaves only consequences. When we walked out of the room, the hallway felt strangely ordinary. People typed at desks. Someone laughed in the distance. Life continued, but something fundamental had changed. Not the volume of my voice, the weight of it. For the first time since this project began, my authority was explicit, not requested, not negotiated, established. And it was established not by raising my tone, but by refusing to let evidence disappear. The strangest part of all of this is how little my daily routine changed. I still arrive early. I still review logs with coffee in hand. I still prefer clarity over theatrics. But internally, something is different. I no longer shrink to maintain comfort. That doesn't mean I dominate meetings or correct every misphrased sentence. It means I understand the architecture of perception and I don't leave it unattended. Authority, I've learned, doesn't require volume. It requires alignment between contribution and visibility. Before the deletion incident, I believed excellence would surface naturally, that if the work was strong enough, recognition would eventually follow. Sometimes it does, but often, excellence without documentation becomes background infrastructure. Essential, invisible. Now, when I speak in meetings, I don't rush. I don't over-explain. I don't apologize for occupying space. I reference timelines. I cite data. I clarify ownership without defensiveness. Not to compete, to anchor. Daniel and I still work in the same building. Our interactions are professional, cordial, measured. There's no hostility, but there's distance. Trust, once audited, becomes conditional. And that's not bitterness, it's wisdom. I don't replay the 11:42 p.m. timestamp in my mind anymore. I don't feel anger when I think about the empty folder that morning. What I feel is gratitude for preparation, because the real turning point wasn't the deletion. It was the decision, weeks earlier, to move from passive silence to intentional structure. Had I continued operating on an assumption, the outcome might have been very different. Projects fail, narratives form, blame settles where it's easiest. Instead, the record existed, and records protect reality. Something else changed too. I no longer see myself as the quiet one. I see myself as precise. Composure isn't absence, it's containment. And containment, when paired with evidence, becomes power. Leadership now consults me directly on system architecture decisions. Not because I demanded it, but because reliability. once proven under pressure, recalibrates perception. I didn't win anything. I didn't defeat anyone. I simply stopped allowing my work and my boundaries to be invisible. And perhaps that's what quiet dominance truly is. Not overpowering someone else, but refusing to erase yourself. When people hear this story, they sometimes expect a dramatic ending, a public apology, a firing, a triumphant speech. There wasn't one. Daniel still works at the company, just in a different capacity of trust. The project succeeded. The model continues to perform well. Leadership moved on, as organizations do. But something permanent shifted. Not in policy, in identity. I used to believe that being low drama was enough. That integrity would naturally defend itself. That if I stayed calm and competent, the right narrative would surface on its own. What I've learned is this: integrity needs structure. Calm needs documentation. Silence needs intention. When my coworker deleted my files to sabotage me, I didn't respond with outrage. I restored everything from cloud backup and shared the activity log. It confirmed his username was deleted at 11:42 p.m. That was enough, because facts, when presented without emotion, are difficult to distort. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about boundaries, about the moment you stop assuming people see your value and start ensuring it's traceable. Sometimes the strongest move isn't confrontation, it's preparation. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't anger, it's evidence. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been positioned as support when you built the structure, if you've ever felt the quiet weight of being reliable but unseen, ask yourself this: are you staying silent by default, or are you choosing silence strategically? I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where documentation, not emotion, changed the outcome of a situation? Let's talk about it in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.